This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the
is
board. Yes.
10:18. And Dave on the board.
Oh, you said that already.
So, okay. The last of summer flowers, I brought in some I'm trying to think of the name. But no, not marigolds. No. Anyway, I brought in some flowers. And last flowers of the season. I've been picking grapes off the pocket prairie and boiling them up and using them as a soup. They've got lots of little seeds in them, so you need to strain them out. A little on the tart side, but rather nice. We've been collecting seeds. Denise Courier has been out there with me, and people pop along and say, hey, nice to see you collecting seeds. We do the same thing. I've had some food from a leftover food from a wedding. Don't do that. So I have a little thing about lightweight aluminum. I took something like 14 pounds of lightweight aluminum trays and Reynolds wrap and things like that to salvage. And some salvage people don't take them at all. And I find the reason is that they are kind of explosive in the Bessemer furnace that is used to melt down cans. So you can't put them in with cans, but you can find salvage people who do take them. You get about 10 cents a pound. So if you have 14 pounds, that's about $1.40, which is not very much, considering you have to wash them out and deliver them. I've been observing the solar panels go in on South 45 and Windsor Road. That's 20 acres of solar energy. I went to the cinema gallery yesterday. I go there for just see what's there after the farmers market, but I also had 3 styrofoam boxes that deliver ice cream frozen, and these boxes are substantial, and they can be used to transmit or post or send artwork that places like the cinema gallery have on display and then need to return to the owner or whatever. And so I delivered 3 of those boxes. Kind of fun. It was a windy day, so 3 boxes lightweight in the wind are rather hard to manage. And as I came through Crane Alley, there were photographers there with reflector panels of aluminum foil or similar material to reflect light onto someone who's being photographed. Crane Alley is a little alleyway in the main street of Urbana. It's a very narrow alley, probably 30 feet across, or might even be less than that, but it's like a walkway, and it comes out near the cinema gallery. The cinema gallery has a regular flow of visitors, And so I met up with David Berg and asked how his associate mathematicians were doing, and we chatted for a while. And then I also chatted to Carolyn Baxley. She got an award for ACE Award just recently for her community work. An example of it is when we were trying to acquire 24 miles of railroad bed from Urbana to Danville for a trail. There was a somewhat run-down interurban depot at Fithian, and she and Norman, her husband, came out and had a look at that, and sort of encouraged us to preserve it, and eventually two people from Fithian did preserve it very well and added another portion to the building to make it livable or economically usable, and in the same style of brick and mortar and roofing as the original building. So Carolyn goes beyond a gallery, which her husband designates as Carolyn's hobby, but she was sitting there putting out posters for the next exhibit, which is by Chris Birdie, a professor at the Parkland College, and Glenn Davies, who is a muralist. He collects circus pictures, so you may have seen a gallery at Cranit of circus pictures at one stage. But he does murals. One that you might see fairly regularly is on the wall of the housing, what do you call it? Well, it's the home recycling center on University Avenue. I can't think of the name at the moment, but but there's a mural along there, which is Glenn Davies doing. So Carolyn was sending out postcards, and very efficiently. She explained that the Bradshaw and Bushman gallery was the last day. So I spent some time there because when I first came to the U.S., I enjoyed the company of artists. I was trying to combine art, education, and science, and that was not regarded as very mature. You having to think about specializing, and I wasn't into doing that, so I knew Glenn Bradshaw, Bushman, David Bushman, and George Foster, Billy Jackson, and visited them and talked to them. With Bradshaw, I would watch him lay translucent and opaque pieces of paper on and make a design and gradually make a visual that was beautiful and impacting on your thought process. In the process, I learned that he grew up in Peoria, and he had a son in University High School, and we talked and chatted. He was a professor of art and taught the beginning art course to general students, and I was taking that, and I was older than most of the students, but I enjoyed, and took classes at the art department, and I wanted to interpret the like of RNA, DNA, biochemical configurations and tables, which in my background in Australia, there was a gap between pure scientists that knew how to apply mathematics and physics and chemistry to these sorts of things, but then the counterpart, more applied agricultural colleges where I was teaching, were having to learn these sorts of things by rote, which didn't work very well. And when they first went out, they would be new and able to interpret the landscape very well. But as the years passed, the degreed Sydney University people would be able to adapt to a new situation using a better background. So I sent Jackson pictures back to Australia to friends. I took a course from George Foster, who grew up in southern Illinois and made sketches of big rocks and some of those experiences that you get when you go to southern Illinois. He also traveled down the Mississippi on a barge to get experience of the landscape that way, and so had a lot to add other than just art. We're very dependent on artists who interpret the landscape for us and ask us to think about the landscape. Bushman I knew because I shared a gallery space with him, a studio space, right above the square. It was, the roof of the building was rather decrepit at the time. This was when Champaign City was more or less a dead central business district, and so Bushman, in his innovation, had erected a tent of plastic over the his studio so that the water ran down the walls rather than onto his paintings. But Bushman was kind of a wild one, and we enjoyed conversations and experiences. Jim Lynch and others that were in a slightly older generation, Nick Zeroli and others that were faculty people I encountered because I used to do art shows with Lucille Zeroli and Gertrude Wiseman and Elvin Mork, who were all local artists of note. And we were all a party to one of the first Arts in the Park presentations in Westside Park, which has continued. So Jim Lynch, I arranged to have come to Anne Zanzi's memorial service in Hinesboro. Anne is married to Jim Zanzi, and we have an association through Jim with the Art Institute in Chicago, and we did field trips there jointly for quite some time. So, this sort of atmosphere to me is very valuable. And I talked to Carolyn. I asked her if she taught at all, and she said early on when they had the whole gallery, the whole cinema studio open, part of it now is about another organization, she would work with the service clubs and work with children in teaching setting. More recently, she's been asked to to speak to the Rotary Club, and we discussed that for a little while. I had wondered if there was a Bradshaw catalogue, because a lot of these images, whether it be Bushman or Foster or Bradshaw, images that are rather wonderful and should find a slot in the art world so that people can share them. Often the pictures that are created are worth $5,000 and $7,000, or prices that are beyond the average citizen, and that means that these pictures often go into homes where the public doesn't get to see them, and so then you hope for a reproduction that might get to more people. I have one such reproduction here, which is rather, we'll put up some images, but these are details by Bradshaw, and there's a little bird sitting there, and just the detail is interesting, and that's a legacy of these people, most of whom have passed on. I have notes here, and I just was checking them out. Glenn Bradshaw has passed on now. Was 91, just after his 91 birthday. He passed, and his son Todd has been putting up some of his legacy paintings on the web, and I've been looking at them and very pleased that they're there. While I was in the gallery, I thought if it was possible to take some rough photographs of the paintings with a cell phone, and I seldom do that because the artists don't like to have you stealing images. But Carolyn said that was okay. It was not a reproductive photograph, it was a cell phone photograph, and I took one or two pictures. And there was someone who was obviously retreated with some of these pictures, and so I didn't do anything more. I went out to the side of the main gallery and looked at the other pictures, and came back in, and the woman was still contemplating and reflecting, and so I said to her, "Did you know these people?" And she said, "Oh, yes." And then she started to tell me about working with Bushman, for instance. She was looking at a Bushman painting, and she was saying that he was very encouraging of her painting work. She had been a student at the University of Illinois, and we're talking about Quay Kester, and she immediately explained to me that the outlining of the fish that Bushman had painted was just enough to give that painting some character, and she carried that with her into her art. She is a medical illustrator from Indianapolis, and had come especially to check the gallery out before it closed. She enjoys doing photography, and that is her specialty. She sometimes photographs operations and now tends to work with people where she uses her art, and it might be a small group of people who are studying art but have some formal or informal psychological concerns. And she explained that sometimes she would have fairly dramatic people come and ask why was she projecting pictures. And it was interesting that her response was that she was wanting to meet with her small class. It can sometimes get very deeply involved, sometimes too deeply involved, to the point where you might want to retreat into art or music. And I was reminded of a small talk that I was listening to about the Trinity Church in New York, which was near to the Twin Towers, where they were coming down. The Trinity Church was a retreat for people who needed to cry for a while, or listen to music, or get energy from art. And that's sort of what she does. If it's necessary to turn the art off, that's okay. But if it was needed to explain it, that was a help. You try very hard to not impose your psyche on the people that you're teaching and working with. You try to find out what are their haunts and habits and where have they come from. And it's not easy to change if you've grown up like I have in the bushland of Australia. Then you grow up with an accent, so you never leave that accent. Likewise, there are situations where you would want to find out what the real talent of that person was. Sometimes we forget that sometimes people with an ADA syndrome have talents that are very real, but they also may have aberrations that are very real. And how do you work with that and find out and give that talent and expression? And some people have never had the opportunity to try to say do art or do music until somebody with the generosity of spirit approaches them and says, why don't you try this? And it might be, why don't you try that? And something else. And perhaps you might find a passion which is what you might enjoy doing. And it might take you away from some of the limitations that might be in the other sides of your character. So we discussed some of these things, and also both took photographs, and some of the photographs were of the details that you might not think about. Like Bushman was doing things as if you had paint put into oils and you moved a sheet of paper around on top, and you could have a display. I'm not sure what that's called, but then we looked closely and it looked quite like Bushman had gone along the edges of some of this with a white outline just to give it character. And if we look at the Bradshaw picture, it would have stones, but there in the background was a barn, or a little bit of something that was human, perhaps a bird, perhaps a piece of grass, but the thread of grass would be the thickness of one camel hair on an end of a worn-out brush. It was just very... and you can look at these sorts of pictures for hours, because you first of all look at the overall picture, but then you start to look at each slab of rock and how it is configured. You look at that tree, and you look at the river, and you look at the water, and your imagination goes crazy, and it's the sort of image that you would love to see a little more public sometimes. So Quay had some stories. She has an interesting name, and she went back to her roots to find out where the name came from, and it was somewhere centered in her aunt's boyfriend years ago, and just that little history gives quality to life, and so here we have someone who comes back to the University of Illinois, where she did her undergraduate work and possibly her master's degree, I don't know. But she also knows Indianapolis, and I also know Indianapolis, and that the legislature is right in downtown, and there's a Connor Prairie, and so we talked about these things for a while. I'm looking at my notes. So we took photographs of each other just because we felt a little different about these people who passed, but they will be around for hundreds of years because of their interpretation of things we sometimes walk past. It's a little bit like people walk past a little pocket prairie and then all of a sudden discover it, and it changes their feeling about downtown Champaign and Market Street, and just those little things help. Often when you have a landscape, the landscape may not be permanent. You may lose it to encroachment, you may lose it to mowing or oversiding. So if you are someone who is doing a very temporary thing like sculpting with ice, then it's only going to last for a few minutes. So it's a very fleeting observation. It may be that you're putting fabric over rocks, or making something that moves, but if it moves too much, it's gone and you've lost it forever. So we need a range of artists, just the same as we need a range of music. And that's part of what's wonderful about WEFT. The range of music is tremendous, and we want that to continue. And often we have trouble trying to maintain that in a very positive manner. We don't want to be too sad about the difficulties of doing these things. They are hard to do. But the reward for doing them is talking to the person who comes in 10 years later and said, wow, you WEFT changed my life. And I was a air shifter here, and I saw things differently.
We might pause for just a second here because it's half past the hour already. And, just mentioned, folks, that you're listening to the Prairie Monk here on WEFT Champaign, 90.1 FM. It is October 18th, 2015. And Dave has been talking about other things than the prairie and rail beds and things like that. He's been talking about a gentleman who just passed away, Bushman Bradshaw, and a woman who apparently studied with him and has moved on to Indianapolis, where she is a military medical illustrator. And I'm sure we'll have lots of other things, including talking about the gallery itself I see coming up in your notes. And with that, I'll step back out again.
Yes, these are people who have passed some time ago, but the retrospect. It was a gallery. And what do you do about that, and how do you encourage it, and do you have things like ACE Awards where people get credit for doing things like working with young children and inspiring them to initiate their own sensitivity. We have a videographer that comes to to record the WEF sessions on Monday night, and he's gotten to a certain point in videography where he has to think he's Ethiopian in background, and what sort of things might inspire him to go further. And then part of what we do is not to have people necessarily come to survive the prairie, but to be challenged and to think about their own things that interest them and how they can tie into groups within a university that might be alternate instead of being fairly regular in engineering department or a biology department. There's a question of, do you join the person who has a specialty and 20 grad students in a laboratory and do his thing, or do you find your own qualifications or own excitement and find a nook or a corner where you can do it? That's one of the reasons why people move around from one university to another. They are looking for the excitement that might inspire their further development. I'm thinking of George Foster, the artist that was a U of I person, who went down the Mississippi on a barge, and part of that was to recognize different landscapes and to interpret same. So as we move into new generations with a computerization, I talked to Quay about her involvement with computers, and yes, she is involved with computers, and I suspect the projections that she projects on the wall while she's talking to people who are in her classes, they're there because of an internet and because of computerization. So we can help. We can sometimes make suggestions or provide a tool. One of my experiences with working with community art shows and being an artist presenting high contrast silkscreen prints was that Nick Zaroli, who was a faculty artist, really bawled me out for standing in front of an art exhibit and talking to someone who was interested. And the reason was that that fills up the art exhibit so people don't see it. And so ever since, that one little comment, that one support was a tool of trade that I've used over and over again, and I've reminded other people to not do that one thing. So some of us who's been around for a while can give a little bit of advice so that even if your passion is totally different, there might be pieces that we can give you that are there. And, I'm trying to... one thing that I thought of was that Quay was doing a more general degree, but she loved painting, and she was painting with Bradshaw. And Bradshaw was watching her from a distance, and if you're painting, to be watched from a distance is can be very disturbing. Artists don't really like to see you going through the process. We've been watching a mural on independent media, and to watch it and photograph it in process is okay, but it takes away the impact of the final piece of art. So Quay was doing that, but eventually Bradshaw said, Quay? No, he didn't. He said, Barbara. He didn't remember Quay because it's sort of a different first name. And he had probably forgotten that, but he said, you ought to think about painting as a career. And that is tremendously helpful to someone who is doing something and they're not quite sure. To have that little piece of encouragement is tremendous. And that happens with us with WEF sessions. Some people come in not being very sure, and they are given a boost when Mike Feldman gives them a CD and gives them some quality recording and some encouragement. That's important. And Bushman did the same thing for Quay, and I felt the same by visiting this old house on Nevada, which was occupied as a studio for Bushman, not Bushman, no, Bradshaw, Foster, and Billy Jackson. And so when I was still trying to combine three fields, art, education, and science, I would talk there and enjoy visiting, and that was an empowerment, and that led me to doing various art courses. I think that's probably enough to suggest that to have a gallery in Urbana is a luxury. To have other art galleries around is also a luxury. Sometimes you have to have the planning community with you, because there was a question not too long ago when planners decided to put up a parking lot, and they needed more finance to keep that going, and so the meters were extended to 9 o'clock at night, and the price of fines and things like that went up, and a number of artists were forced to leave Champaign and go to other places. So we have to be careful how we encourage. At the moment, the Lincoln Building has a number of artists, and Tom Panther, the manager, and Dr. Youngerman, the owner, encourages a bunch of artists in studio space, which was actually built for attorneys in 1919. And those artists appear in a lot of places. One very pleasing expression at the moment is an exhibit, The Grateful Dead. I think it's Chapman is the artist, and he has space in the Lincoln Building, but there was in the small gallery that goes with the food co-op in Urbana. So if you get a chance to see that, I think it's a very good example of how we move art around. It's a little bit competitive because you're in a situation where there are many, many artists, so that means you have to be pretty good or pretty aggressive to survive in this sort of climate. how do you do that, and how do you do it nicely, and how does that take you to other places? And we think of Mark Rubel just up the road from us, who for a long time has been a supporter of WEFT with a landline under the buildings to WEFT, and teaching courses that quite a few people, including Mike Feldman, have taken. And he has graduated to being a professor in university in Nashville, and so we hear from him. But he's moved out, and it will be replaced. His studio will be replaced by a recording studio. But, so I'm encouraging that sort of movement, and some of you may remember Captain Rats and the Blind Ribbits, and these are a bunch of people who are about the same age. They don't practice together. Their show is their practice, their independence, their way of doing things, and we encourage that. And same thing with Mike and Molly's. Last night we had a cello player who's been at the WEF sessions, who comes from Casey, Illinois, and does very well with a guitar and a electronic cello. And she has likewise been encouraged by parents who allow her to encourage her to do things that she wanted to do, and to transport her around when she was too young to do that herself. And she's at the ripe old age of 25, is moving on. And so on and on again, we find that these community things, whether it's independent media or WEFT or the Rotary Club, are agencies where we get together. A little independent meeting of people on Oregon Street and a barbecue once every Tuesday night brings together perhaps 20 or 30 people who meet with each other and share. And some of the excitement of this is that you're bouncing off other people. So you're not just there alone doing your work, but you're bouncing off each other with questions, and they make you think. So sometimes there's teamwork going on here, which we didn't always have, because universities have tended to be monolithic. Always there have been enclaves where there are little groups of people getting together and meeting and doing poetry in the basement, or dreaming about a steam engine flywheel. So they're getting together, and that has always been, whether it's a century ago or now. But there's been a move once you get the internet. We've been able to use Facebook, whether you use it in a positive or a negative manner. Facebook has lifted people into a more liberal use of the information that might be obtained. David especially can go to the internet immediately and get information about aluminum, what happens to aluminum, or just a question. It's amazing how fast. And I've been learning some of this, but it takes talent to do a database and get it up there. And then what do you do about all those people who only use computers to do email? How do you get them to go a little bit further and a little bit further? And there's always a learning curve, folks. But we encourage that, and we make use of it ourselves. Right now we're dealing with an article for Rails to Trails movement. It's a magazine that came to us we've talked about this before. They will 2 years ago, I guess, I asked a question of the regional director, Eric Olberg, the regional director of Rails to Trails, who was producing a book, or produced a book, that dealt with rails and trails, rails adjacent to a trail or trail adjacent to an active line. And I wanted to ask, how much habitat did that take out? And so 2 years later, a journalist from Rails to Trails has been encouraged to come and talk to us, and then a journal photographer. The journal has a publisher, and the publisher has a photographer, and he came. And the difficulty is for us to provide that sort of group of people who doesn't really know what you're doing, and it's fairly complex. How do we tell those people quickly what we do? And there's a question of what is it that they want to report, and you don't know what's going to be written and what's going to be photographed. So it's back and forth, because we don't always know what that picture is. What that picture is a picture of an invaded railroad bed where there's a crop of soybeans. Then way in the distance is the rail trail continuing. And if you bring two lines of yellow that Dave can put in on a photograph, they indicate the quarter of a mile that has been encroached. So we have to explain that. But in order to explain that, you have to sometimes explain the Rail Banking Act, which has saved 20,000 miles of railroad beds. And you have to take the photographer to places that might be exciting for a photographer, but not necessarily what you might think of as an icon of your prairie. The journalist may go to some places and the photographer to others, and that may be our fault because we don't exactly know what we're wanting. But to work it out, to back and forth with emails, means that we're working as a team to say something about the preservation of natural history along railroad lines, which were preserved because the railroads couldn't be legally invaded by adjacent farming. It asks the question of, should we have more biodiversity? Because there is a photograph of just big bluestem. And the big bluestem is there because the Department of Transportation wants to put in a roadside prairie on land that's a little bit away from the road. But is that a useful photograph if prairie that you're trying to save is biodiverse? So you would want to say, could this photograph be replaced by a prairie at White Heath or a prairie at Monticello that is more biodiverse? And could you perhaps pop in a specific photograph because you've taken the photographer there, and he has photographed items like purple gentian, which are rather rare, and he's put his energy and his specialty and his equipment into making an image of this railroad corridor. So in there somewhere we have a photograph of the Railroad Museum Depot, and that means that in many cases Heartland Pathways, which is our venue, is working with other people. So that bridge may not be owned by Heartland Pathways. We're talking about working with other groups. So how do you write a simple caption under the photograph to indicate how this relationship works? How do you work the bridge with the Vermilion County Conservation District that has the ownership and the willingness to put $2 million into preparing that bridge for bikers and hikers? If it is a photograph of the Monticello Railroad Museum, we have to be cautious, because if we're wanting to get the 7 miles of Railroad Museum to extend into Champaign, then that's 25 miles, and that's a little bit too much for the average young child that's on a historic train. How can we explain that we need other things to happen? We need to be able to visit a wooden elevator. We need to be able to visit a prairie, or do things that break the perhaps monotony of a historic train. It also involves things that are in the future that are somewhat intangible at the moment. We're talking about trying to preserve 3 miles of railroad bed between Bonneville and Seymour, and that brings us into the discussion of abandonment. And do you have the opportunity to have an interim trail use? That's a method of the federal government preserving rail beds, but you get to use it as a bicycle track. That means that the rail itself will come out. But the real attempt is to preserve the right-of-way, even if you have to later put back the rail to get a historic train into Champaign. How do you in one day transmit that sort of information and that sort of imagery to people who are being very generous to look at your work and try to sample it and record it in a manner that is journalistically appropriate and photographically exciting? So we've been working with this. So it's getting towards the end. So I'm wanting to encourage you to go out into the prairie. You see, leaves have been frosted now. Many of the plants have lost their viability. You have to know that they have deep roots and they'll survive. They're mostly perennials in the prairie, and they will come back next year. Next spring they will grow, and if you have them in pots, you have to be very careful because they have a need for insulation over winter. So if you have a prairie plant that's in a small pot, then it should be dug into the soil so that it has protection. But so now is the time when there are pods full of seeds. So if I go to a baptisia and open the little pod, and there are 10 or 15 little yellow seeds, and each one of them will grow. So we have to go out there and pick. We have to take the liatris and milk it off and put it in a rough, tough situation, because liatris can handle a rough, tough situation. We may have to think about, in spring, making room for a 10 by 10 plot in your backyard with lots of sunlight, where you can go to the Grand Prairie Friends prairie plant sale and buy little plants that will have already deep roots and have a start, and you can put them out. You have to think about those plants that will give you instant gratification and start to allow people to know what a prairie is, because it may take 10 years for some of those plants to grow to a maturity where you can recognize their flowers and their structure of their plant. I think that's the end of us today. Thank you for listening. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And
Dave, of course, one time I have to speak. Dave on the board. And speaking of big blue stem, which Dave did a little bit ago, big blue stem, it's, as he says, it's past its prime now for this season, but I happen to know that there's a band in the area, a bluegrass band, also called Big Blue Stem, and they have a free concert coming up this afternoon that I intended to be at. They're playing at the Champaign Public Library from 2 to 3 o'clock this afternoon, and Dave and I will be working together for a while, but I have books to drop off, books to pick up from the library, so I aim to be over there. Again, that's live bluegrass music at the Champaign Public Library at 2 o'clock this afternoon from a local band called Big Blue Stem. Oh yes, and since we're down to the last minute, I'd better mention the views expressed here on the Prairie Monk are solely those of the speakers and no one else.